We now move into functionalist theories of crime and deviance. As you know, functionalism and conflict theory are much more macro-oriented theories. So they're going to be more concerned with big picture type issues concerning crime and deviance, issues related to social structural aspects of crime and deviance, the relationship between class and crime, um, uh, the criminal justice system as an institution, and so on and so on. We're going to learn in this little segment about two functionalists and their ideas about crime. And you've heard of both of them. So the first one is Emil Durkheim, our old pal Emil Durkheim. And he had a little theory of crime. He talked a little bit about it in Division of Labor and Society. And he argued that crime is functional for society, that it actually contributes to social order. Now, there's something we need to understand, right, about Durkheim saying that crime is functional for society. It contributes to social order. The language functionalists would use here is they would say crime is positively functional for society. Now, when Durkheim says crime is functional, or we say that crime is positively functional for society, we're not saying that crime is good. We are saying, though, that there are consequences of crime and deviance in society that actually contribute to the maintenance of the social order. Remember that functionalists argue that the tendency of any social system is toward order. And Durkheim would say, well, crime is a social fact. There is a certain amount of crime or a certain amount of deviance, of norm violation in every society. Therefore, it is a social fact. As a social fact, it has consequences. Some of its consequences are positively functional for society. On one hand, he would be saying in other words, there is an optimal rate of crime in a society, a rate at which crime is minimized but not eliminated. It's never eliminated because it's a social fact. It exists in every society. But too much crime would mean, in other words, if the crime rate were very, very high, it would mean that society is actually falling apart. It would mean that the moral consensus of society is breaking down. And if you recall from our discussion of Durkheim, moral consensus is the foundation of society, right? Agreement about fundamental norms and values and so on in society. That's what makes solidarity. So too much crime means that society is falling apart. People they're not following the rules, they're not following the norms, they're doing whatever they want. And that's tearing apart the social order. On the other hand, if there were no crime in society, if the rate of crime were near zero, that might mean that people are not obeying the rules, they're not obeying the law because they consent to those rules, right? That they're obeying those rules maybe because of fear, or fear of the consequences of violating the rules. And if we are obeying simply out of fear, that doesn't mean that we necessarily accept the rules or the norms of society. Okay, so the way that crime functions for society is that it reinforces the moral consensus in certain ways. So how does it do that? Well, it's going to do it in three basic ways. The first way is that deviance clarifies moral boundaries and affirms norms, right? It clarifies moral boundaries and it affirms norms. So when someone deviates, when someone, for example, commits a crime, society responds to that violation. And the way they're going to respond to it is going to define where the line is of what is acceptable and what is not acceptable. And that moral boundary has to be continually marked, or it has to be continually drawn. And we know that it moves. I gave you the example in the beginning of marijuana, right? So at one time, marijuana was seen as marijuana use was seen as highly deviant. Now we know that that line has moved. It's moved in the direction of acceptability. So deviance clarifies and continually defines and affirms the moral boundaries of society. Another way that deviance and crime contributes to the social order is that it promotes social unity. In other words, when somebody acts criminally and society responds to that crime collectively, it actually brings us all together. One of the examples that I like to use of this would be 9/11. So on September 11th, you guys don't remember, but we were all watching on our TVs, right, at the same time. We were watching these planes fly into the World Trade Center, and we were hearing the news from Shanksville, and we were hearing the news from the Pentagon. And we were, in other words, collectively outraged. And the fact that we were all collectively outraged, Durkheim would have seen that as significant. That social unity, that collective outrage over those events would reinforce our feeling of moral consensus, would reinforce our shared sense of belonging to the same moral community, and therefore reinforce solidarity. Now, on September 12th, there was a lot of disagreement over what we should do in response to the events of 9/11. But there was very little disagreement, right, that what had happened on 9/11 was a horrible, horrible, terrible thing. The third way that deviance is functional for society is that it promotes social change. Challenge to the law, challenge to convention promotes social change. So one way that we can maybe think about this is think about the civil rights movement. If we reflect on the idea that a lot of protest, a lot of ways that people were protesting segregation laws in the South was through really criminal acts. So, for example, black folks sitting down and occupying whites-only lunch counters in Birmingham, Alabama, or someplace like that, they were breaking the law when they did that. They were committing crimes, and they were arrested and they were put in jail. But these these crimes, these actions by these protesters started to get people to think about the law, started to get people to think about whether the law made sense, whether it was a just law. So what starts as these boundary violations sometimes gain enough support that they become new and acceptable behavior. So in that sense, we can talk about how deviance, therefore, even crime, certain kinds of crime, promote social change. Now we have another functionalist named Robert Merton. All right. Robert Merton is what we would consider a strain theorist. Now we learned a little bit about Robert Merton in chapter 1. Okay, remember we talked about Merton and how he came up with this idea of functionality and dysfunctionality. And he is going to now tell us something about crime. And I think I said on that day that if you're a criminal justice major or you're studying criminology, that you at some point in your career are going to get a heavy dose of Robert Merton. And so what we're talking about right now is exactly what you would be getting, Robert Merton's theory of crime. And he's going to say that crime is normal to society. Crime is normal to society. So, like Emil Durkheim, crime is a social fact. But he has a different understanding of it. He's trying to think more about the causes of crime, not the consequences of crime, like Durkheim did. He's trying to think about the causes of crime. What causes crime? Well, to him, it's actually mainstream values in society that might generate crime. People develop strong desires to reach certain kinds of cultural goals, but not everyone has access to society's acceptable, or in other words, the institutionalized means. So let me talk about those words for a minute. Goals and means. Those are really two kinds of values. Goals and means are two kinds of social values. There are socially acceptable goals. Remember when we were doing culture and we were talking about the core values of American culture, one of the things we said was that a core value of American culture is success. It's an acceptable goal. Everyone should strive to be successful. So that's one value that Americans more or less share, okay? Now, there's also the idea of means, how to achieve that goal. We have values about how to achieve that goal, acceptable ways to achieve that goal. So if we go back to that list again of core American values, we have the goal of success, and then we also have the value that we place on education. So how do you become successful? By working hard. That's another value we have, right? You work hard and you get a good education, go to college, and that takes you on your way to achieving the goal of success. However, for some people, there's a disconnect between the acceptable goals and the acceptable means. And when there's that disconnect between acceptable goals and acceptable means, people experience frustration. They are blocked somehow from either the means or the goals or both. And when people experience this frustration, Merton called that strain. What they're experiencing is strain. That's why it's called strain theory. So as a result of that frustration, people might have difficulty either accepting the cultural norms as either the cultural norm of the goal or the cultural norm of the means as legitimate. They might, for example, feel wronged by the system. And that feeling of being wronged by the system that comes out of the strain that people are experiencing is what he called anomie. Remember, Durkheim used that word, anomie. And as a result of that strain and as a result of this feeling of anomie, people might choose deviant or criminal pathways. And that's what we're going to talk about next. So in your book, and I got this one off the internet, but in your book somewhere you have a chart that summarizes Merton's strain theory. And if you look at the extreme left-hand column, right, you see, right, accepts the goal of success. So that column there is about, do people accept or reject the goal? In this case, the goal of success. The next column, the socially acceptable means, the socially acceptable way to succeed. Do people accept the socially acceptable path to success, or do they reject the socially acceptable path to success? Now, when people accept both the goal, now read from left to right on the top row. When people accept the goal of success, and they accept the means, which might be hard work and education, as the way to achieve that goal of success, they are conforming. So accepting the goal and accepting the means is what Merton would call conformity. Now, come over to that next column that says deviant response. In that column, people are going to reject either the goal or the means or both. And we have innovation, ritualism, retreatism, and rebellion. And those are what Merton would call deviant pathways. And then he has examples of deviant pathways there. So let's go back to the left. So what happens when we have a person that accepts the goal of success? And one way that we measure success is maybe financial success, right? So we accept the goal of success, but reject the means, reject the socially acceptable way to succeed, which might be hard work and education. That deviant pathway is what Merton calls innovation, an innovative pathway. And an example of that would be a criminal. Because what happens? Well, maybe you have a person that accepts the goal of success, maybe like financial success, but rejects the means, like hard work, and finds an illegal way to succeed, right? Now, let me go off on a little tangent here. There is a sociologist named Jane McLeod, and he wrote a book called Ain't No Making It, about life in a low-income area of Boston. And he is interviewing some teenage boys, and he's talking to one of these teenage boys, and he's really asking him about where he sees himself after high school, where he sees himself as an adult. And the kid says, "Well, I want to be rich, right? I want to be rich, and I want to live in a nice house, and I want to drive a nice car, and all those things, right?" And McLeod says to him, "Well, that's okay. That sounds good. How do you intend to get there, right? How do you intend to reach your goal?" And he says, "I'm going to become the best cocaine dealer in Boston." And so there's your example. He accepts the goal, the culturally legitimate goal of success, but rejects the means, and has chosen or will choose an illegal way to succeed. That's the innovator, right? The next one we have is the ritualist, ritualism. So in that one, the person rejects the culturally acceptable goal of success, but accepts the means, hard work, for example, as an appropriate way to succeed. So the ritualist is really a person who's more or less going through the motion, right? Look at what the chart says. Acts as if he wants to succeed, but does not exert much effort. And an example that he uses there, or an example that this chart uses there, is the unmotivated teacher. So I don't know how many of you people watch The Simpsons, but every teacher that teaches at Springfield Elementary School on The Simpsons is this ritualist. Like Mrs. Krabappel is a ritualist, and maybe Stan in the office is a ritualist. He punches in the morning, he puts in his time, and more or less is kind of going through the motions. Excuse me, just trying to get to retirement. Okay. So the ritualist rejects the goal of success, but accepts the means. The retreatist is the next one. The next deviant pathway is the retreatist. This is the person that wants to drop out completely. So this represents a rejection of both the legitimate goal and the legitimate means, right? The legitimate way to achieve the goal. You reject the goal of success, and you reject the means. You reject the goal of, let's say, financial success, and you reject the means of hard work, and you want to get out of the rat race, right? Maybe. And so there are different ways that you could drop out. So if I look at, innovation is definitely a criminal pathway. Ritualism is not necessarily a criminal pathway, but it's a deviant pathway. And retreatism is one of those things that could be either, right, a criminal pathway or a deviant pathway. Um, uh, I think it all depends, right, on what it is you are retreating into, what it is you are escaping into. So if I drop out uh, to become a heroin addict, right, that might be a criminal pathway. But if I reject your corporate rat race and go off and live by myself in a cabin in the mountains, that might not be a criminal pathway. Then we get to the last one here, where we are substituting goals and means. So we reject the goal of success, but we're going to replace it with another goal. We reject the means of hard work, but we're going to replace it with another means. So we have here the rebel, right? This is rebellion. So it involves the substitution of a new way to achieve a new goal. And that is Merton's whole thing, right, on strain theory. Again, rebellion is not necessarily a criminal pathway. It depends on the manner in which a person or people rebel. Now, influenced by Robert Merton is some other thinkers here who talk about illegitimate, what we call illegitimate opportunity structures. So this is one of the first places where we can begin to describe the difference in the relationship between street crime and white collar crime, right? Crime in the streets versus crime in the suites. And what a lot of sociologists understand is that social classes have distinct styles of crime, right? Social classes have distinct styles of crime. Classes differ in terms of their access to opportunities, including the opportunity to commit crime, right? We all have a relationship to opportunity structures. We can think of some of those opportunity structures as legitimate opportunity structures. Your access to education is an example of an access to a legitimate, right, opportunity structure. But we also have opportunities to commit crimes. And those things are what Richard Cloward and Lloyd Owen in 1960, who were interested in juvenile delinquency, called illegitimate opportunity structures. So they're influenced by Merton, but they were saying that one of the reasons why people commit crimes is they have more access to illegitimate opportunity structures. It's not that they have less access to legitimate ones, they have more access to illegitimate ones, okay? So illegitimate opportunity structures are defined by Henslin as opportunities for crimes that are woven into the texture of life, right? Including the realities of social class. So what that means, for example, is that if I'm in the working class, the kinds of illegitimate opportunity structures that I'm going to have available to me are going to be more in line with street crime, right? If I'm middle class or maybe upper class, the kinds of illegitimate opportunity structures that I have open to me are going to be more in line with what we can call white collar crime and corporate crime, right? If I'm a poor person, I'm not going to have very many opportunities to commit, let's say, embezzlement, right? Or insider trading or stock fraud or anything like that. However, if I am middle class or upper class, I'm going to have access to these illegitimate opportunity structures to commit those kinds of crimes. I'm going to have illegitimate opportunities, let's say, to commit embezzlement or to commit stock fraud, and so on. Okay, so I hope you understand that. So the kinds of opportunities we have to commit crimes are defined by our relationship to social class. So to summarize, right, the opportunities to commit crime will be different for the poor and the working classes as opposed to the middle and upper classes. For the poor and the working classes, the opportunities for crime will more likely be of the character of street crime. People of the middle and upper classes with different opportunities can commit white collar and corporate crime. So where we're going to head now in the next section is we're going to talk about the conflict model.